I'm going to talk about the social networks and archival context project, and that is actually not what I came here to talk about, actually. I was going to give you the jaded view of someone who's spent close to 30 years modeling data in one context or another, but a lot of people expressed an interest in this project, and while I'm not going to go into the data modeling in any explicit way, I do think it raises all kinds of issues about the use of data models, what you can do with data that is smarter data than raw data that we were talking about before. I really don't like this display that PowerPoint's giving me because I can't see the, and I can't do anything about it. Let me stand out here. I'll switch and then stand out here and speak really loudly. First thing I'd like to talk about is the funding timeline for it. It's funded by a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. It began in a two-year project, began 2 years ago, so it will formally come to an end at the end of next month. But at the end, I'll talk about what might happen after that period. The people involved are myself and Worley Martin at the University of Virginia, Ray Larson at the University of California, Berkeley, and Brian Tingle and Adrian Turner at the California Digital Library in Oakland, California. Does anyone know how to, this is, PowerPoint's a new one for me.
Not to brand myself as any kind of PowerPoint expert here. Can you?
You know what I'll do? I'll do this instead.
Just see the same thing that I can see.
Yeah. Well, that's what I was trying to get it to do, but it didn't want me to. I'm just going to go with this instead because I can see it. Can you all see it fine?
Is it mirroring the
displays? It's giving me a little slide at the bottom with two panes, but I have no mouse. So I don't. Okay. I have a lot to get through here, so. Okay, so the project's objectives succinctly stated, on one hand, the audience in the community that I'm interested in are archivists and manuscript librarians, and having been involved for a long time in transforming what was an analog-based descriptive system into a machine-readable descriptive system. Part of what I'm up to here is furthering that process of creating a machine-readable environment for archival description. And this particular step involves taking the description of people that create and are documented in archival records and separating the description of them from the description of the records as such. But beyond that, it's also designed for the users of archives, which is to say many of you in this room and a fairly large portion of the scholarly world that's interested in things human, as well as a large portion of the general public. And so the first thing is in terms of enhancement, is providing integrated access to archival resources by and about or documenting a particular person, corporate body, or family. It's one of the holy grail is unified access. But the other thing that we're doing is we're providing the social professional context within which the people lived and worked. And you'll see this demonstrated if I don't run out of time. What we're doing and the data that we're working with is around 30,000 archival finding aids or guides descriptions encoded in encoded archival description. And then, in addition to that, we have authority records from the Library of Congress and authority records from the Union List of Artist Names from the Getty. And finally, that number there, actually of 5 million, we now are working with 16 million virtual international file records, which we use for matching purposes and to help in identity resolution. So the processing that we're engaged in here essentially is done in 3 steps. The first of which is done at Virginia, the second of which at Berkeley, and the third is done at the California Digital Library. But what we're doing is extracting information, the names, and when we can, the description of people, either as corporate bodies, persons, or families, from the archival description, and assembling that into encoded archival context CPF records. That CPF is corporate bodies, persons, and families. Then we subsequently match those records against one another in a process called identity resolution, and it's a bit tricky. So what you're essentially doing is, if you have the same name string or similar name strings, is it for the same person or not? And when we decide that it is for the same person, we're merging them together and then keeping track of all of the information and where we got it. And then subsequent to that, they're matched against, mostly so far, the virtual international authority file, where we pick up and go through the same identity resolution process and acquire and aggregate additional data that we find there. So you can see I just laid out the key challenge in that second bullet point. And then finally, taking the resulting set of these matched, merged, enhanced records, we're creating a prototype historical resource and access system, which is, the historical data, the social professional networks within which the people existed, but links to archive, library, and museum resources. The source data, as I've mentioned, just to say a bit more about it, are these EAD encoded finding aids created by archivists, manuscript librarians. And as they currently stand, they intermix the description of records with the description of creators. The description of the creators from an archival point of view is thought of as providing context for understanding the records. So you have these records that emanate from one source, and in order to interpret them, understand them, you need to know something about who created them and what was the context in which they were created. And some of these have very, very detailed description of the creators. They vary wildly. While the archival community has been engaged in this sort of ongoing process of becoming more standardized and normalized and more of a consensus, the quality of practice is irregular. So if you go to the Library of Congress, the finding aids there are created by the divine guidance of God, and most everyone else does something far more human than what they do at the Library of Congress. Many of the names are given but not identified as such, so some of the names are tagged, so easily found. In other cases, there's names, one would like to say, some of the contexts are in a natural language context, but the others, they're in a very strange context that's not natural language, but they're there. One of the things that we're focusing on is a lot of papers, private papers, have correspondents in them. And so we're particularly interested in if this person corresponded with this person, because then we can establish as a fact that they have some social professional relation between them. In other cases, we can't identify that, and I drop that into an ambiguous category. They're merely associated. Sometimes those associations are purely intellectual. So if someone collected Dante, for example, you'll see a link from this person to 20th century person to Dante, and you clearly know that they didn't know one another personally, but there's an intellectual relation between the two. Okay. I'm going to speed this up a little bit since I want to show you the demo, which is what most people want to see. This is a bit on archival records. One of the key things to know about them, Alan brought up the word intentionality yesterday, is archival records, well, and then went on to qualify exactly what he meant by intentionality, which was not what most of us assume he meant by the word intentionality. But records, by saying that records are the byproduct of people living and doing their work, is quite frequently the records we generate when we're doing a digital humanities project is we're intentionally building a digital humanities project, but in the process of doing that, we're sending emails to people, we're writing grant proposals, we're doing all kinds of other things that serve the purpose of building that humanities project. So the project out there is the intentionally built thing. And then these other things are byproducts of us following through on that intention. And so we have, in fact, the archive of a digital humanities project is all those records that document the creating of the digital humanities project. I was trying there to make this whole notion relevant to this group. I hope that succeeded. The underlying standard, in addition to the EAD, is this thing called encoded archive, this schema called encoded archival context, CPF. And again, it's designed for describing corporate bodies, persons, and families. It's based on the International Council for Archive standard, ISAR-CPF. It's an international group of people behind its design. And just a touch of what the tagging looks like in there. This is the identity section, and what you're seeing there is at the top an identity type, which is to say it's a person here, and then you have a name entry, in this case for Oppenheimer, and there is no such thing in this system as an explicitly a top identified authorized form. You just have different names for the same entity, but there are ways to designate which of those names is the one you prefer within your catalog. Things like exist dates. Probably skip down that local description, language used by the person or languages used by the person, occupation or occupations that the person had. And then one of the things that you find frequently in these descriptions is what we call a chronological list, which is a sequence of rows with a date, a place, an event in them. There are ways of extending this, so if you wanted to type it in such a way to say, participate in a conceptually modeled world, you could do it. You can create timelines out of this. We haven't gotten to doing that yet. This would be a case of linking one person to another person. So the role here using a Ferber entity is to say that out at the other end of this is a person corresponded with, relation entry. A resource relation. Okay, so quickly, the year one extraction. This is a little bit out of date because I put these slides together a few months ago and we've done a bit more processing. But in essence, we've extracted close to 200,000 names from the 30,000 finding aids, and then winnowed those down to about 100 and, well, we'll see when I show you the prototype. I can't remember the exact number. Okay, now what's next in all of this? It's actually Judgment Day for me. I'll find out whether this next step goes forward today. But if so, we'll vastly expand both the research agenda and the source data. And it'll have at least a bit of an international flavor to it in terms of adding in a lot of data from the UK and a little bit of data from France. Also, taking place in parallel is an Institute for Museum and Library Services funded project where we're going to try to transform what we're doing into a sustainable national cooperative program. So I have a series of meetings set up to begin writing up a blueprint for what that would mean. And then finally, since I'm running out of time here, I'll have to cut and paste this since this is not active as a link. And unfortunately, it doesn't look very good because it wasn't designed for such low resolution. But, so it's about 130, that close to 200,000 reduced to about 130,000 names, which you can go in and search. We've featured some out here because a lot of things end up just being a name and not much else, linked to one resource. But for some of the more interesting people, I like to do Vannevar Bush since he's the hero of linking, thinking machine, the web, the cement, you know, everyone looks at him as the father. So here's Vannevar Bush. I can see here that he was an engineer, a physicist, a public official, a science administrator. I can read a biography of his life. I can go off to the right, and given the limited source data here, I've identified him in 9 archival collections. He's the creator of this collection here in the Library of Congress. He's referenced in 8 more here. In addition to that, he's also associated with these 46 people, these 19 corporate bodies, the additional resources found here, linked data here, so you can go off to a VF record, and we've had DBPD as well, so you can go off there. And then, you know, this is in the early stages, but everyone seems to like this. Here he is mapped into a radial graph. And the interesting thing about Vannevar Bush is you can find him connected with Robert Oppenheimer, who was the father of the atomic bomb, whom you'll find related to T.S. Eliot, whom you will find connected to Marx, but not Karl, but Groucho Marx, which makes Groucho Marx 2 degrees of separation from the father of the atomic bomb. I have no idea what that means, but, so I'll stop there. Questions? Yes.
So this problem of like normalizing people, right, is obviously one of the huge elephants in the room. So the other elephant in the room, in the same
Literally and figuratively.
Sorry?
Normalizing people.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And
Sorry.
There is no normalizing people. So in the same data, right, you have some other elements, like the locations, for example. Right?
Yeah.
So it's a very, very similar problem, and it would also be useful to do that, right? So And are you dealing with that problem?
Yeah,
or-
yeah, well, it falls into the category of identity resolution. So if you have two strings that you have reason to believe may be for the same entities, then trying to algorithmically determine whether they're for the same entity, whether it's geographic or a person or a corporate body. And then the other thing is, and we're not dealing with this yet with geographic names, but the underlying encoding framework will support this. So what we want to do is we're going to take the timelines where we have events like he was born here, did this here, and we'll process those and match them against a geographic name authority file, and do the same thing we're doing with the other names, and then we'll pick up the coordinate information. And then the idea is we take a chronological list and we can do a mashup with a timeline and a map. Okay.
Another question is, one of our questions, just like yesterday we had human research in this office.
Yeah.
This is a very typical kind of example. Data models always use the ones where we have the most data. Where the problem is, if you take 20% where we have 80% of the data for, that might give you some solution which may totally multiply to the long tail of names where you have one document and one name.
Yeah.
How do you deal with
And under-identified, say with no, birth date or death date or anything else. I mean, there's a few ways that you can do this from a processing point of view, and one of them is the context out of which you retrieve the name to begin with. So let's say you have a name string that shows up with this physicist and a name string that shows up with this physicist, and it's similar name strings. The fact that each of them is associated with two physicists may or may not help you tip the balance towards identity resolution. Typically what you do is you get matched candidates, and then you're looking for some evidence which you can weight. And then if you have enough accumulated weight in terms of the additional evidence, and you can slide this scale, and you also have to review and do recall relevance evaluation of what you're doing in order to sort of slide your algorithms. But you can get it pretty accurate. The people at OCLC Research have gotten quite good at this.
Are you doing this automatically? The assurance that if you have different...
Yes. At this point, it's all being done algorithmically. Yeah, by Ray Larson. He's. I can give you some citations, not off the top of my head, to some of Ray's work, but there's also a lot of other literature on the subject, and it involves reading all kinds of mathematical symbols at some point if you get into it.
One other comment. So that's a very interesting thing for data models, right? Because if you go down and say the second most frequent thing to having only one document will be two documents, or say for people will be two countries which they are associated with,
Yeah.
and that would probably be 20% or 30% of the data, and for these 20 or 30% of the data, you have no decision whatsoever.
Yeah.
It should go
Yeah.
one way or the other.
Yeah.
And data models on a more
Yeah.
from top, they usually don't think of like, how do I actually encode that I cannot decide if it should go this way or the other.
Yeah, well, one of the things that we would like to do and haven't done yet is encode a relation between two entities and say, maybe the same as. Okay, then if you started a national cooperative, those would be flagged for some human being to come in to see if they can find additional data and resolve it. Then you can envision easily a future in which, if you get all that off the ground, which we'll see, is add a social computing network to it so that the public can come in and make suggestions and say, that's my aunt so-and-so who was born County Cork, in this year, blah, blah, blah.
Michael?
Question about the converse problem and whether it arises and if so, how you deal with it.
Yeah, I know where you're going with this, Michael.
And I don't know enough about archival practice to know whether it happens in finding aids as it happens in post-graphic work. You have
People make mistakes.
You think
Yeah,
it's one person, and you later decide it's two or three.
yeah,
You know, we don't have very much data, so we all go into homes, get three names, call
Right.
them the same guy. Later you discover, no, one of them is a justice of the Supreme Court,
yeah.
there's a poet.
And another was an archivist.
Does the rise, do you handle that?
Well, from our perspective, keeping two names apart when you're in doubt is better than merging them together because it obscures it. And so one of the things is you want to make sure that in terms of your matching and merging, that you're reliable. So one of the things we'll be doing, you know, God willing, in the next phase of this is we have an outside person to go through and systematically, manually go through and check. And then OCLC Research is making available to us some software for quality assessment on it. And that's an absolutely critical piece of this. And the whole issue of identity resolution is, of course, it's absolutely critical. And it's a very hot topic in the IP world right now as they begin to implement ISNI and ORCID and other things. That piece of it is.
So, Daniel, if I understood correctly, a large part of the project is to take large data sets from disparate sources and kind of pull them in. I don't recognize all those sources, but the ones I do don't share a common format. I don't even think they share really necessarily a common data model behind the format. How did you?
Well, which of the formats? I mean, where I'm extracting all the data at the moment is EAD. And again, you know, if all goes well, also you have some archival descriptions, about 2 million of them.
The Library of Congress will hand you a record
Yeah.
that doesn't look like an EAD record.
Well, Library of Congress is not going to do that, but WorldCat's going to give me marked bibliographic records, and you'll write a separate process for extracting the names and assembling the EAC-CPF. So, you know, one, you know, it's a different mapping.
So any particularly interesting observations on the different data models that you've had to suck in?
You know, mostly we're dealing so far with you know, the EAD and the EAC-CPF, and then for the VIF, you know, Getty has its own, and we've deciphered that and have mapping models for it. You know, VIF has its own for doing its cluster records. And I mean, the way this is all done is Ray Larson has to index all of this stuff in Cheshire, his state-of-the-art XML indexing tool. So yeah, at the moment, the last thing he did was you know, he already mapped over the schema for the VIF records, for example. It's all in all the data is coming in XML. And his latest development is he's created n-gram indices to 16 million cluster records. Yeah, but there's actually a cluster would be authority records from different places around the world that are deemed to be for the same entity in identity resolution. They aggregate them.
I'd like to come back to the issue of people being identical. For instance, it's the point of binary decisions. They're either the same or not the same. Once you get into geographical entities, for instance, like Max was alluding to, very rarely things are exactly the same as. They are mostly
Could you speak up?
Oh, I said as long as you are with the persons, the decisions you can take are binary, same as or not. Whereas if you get into geographical entities, for instance, you have different degrees of similarity.
Right. Identity resolution's a whole different challenge there.
So what are your plans for coping with those, considering that there is a big discussion in the linked data community about all say as how to use them.
In a certain sense, we're completely punting on that. It's not part of our problem set as such. I mean, it's part of your problem set. Whatever you figure out, let me know.
That's right.
This is collaborative. So.
We already 10 minutes over time, and so please, short questions, short answers. Susan.
I know I can stand up later. I wonder, with the visualization you had, is there a way for me to interpret that to show, so I can see exactly that relationship?
Not that particular paragraph, but essentially the relations we've pulled down into a stack of RDF triples, and we have a sparkle endpoint.
Right,
So if you
as
know
a
how to
user-
write sparkle, you can go in and query it.
But as a user, it would be really useful if once I see something, to say, let me see
Yeah,
how that happened.
yeah. Next iteration.
Next
Susan.
iteration.
I have a question concerning this visualization as well. The lines between the entities, are they qualified in some way, or does it just mean that
They have a simple qualification. They're not color
the
coded.
one entity is mentioned in the record of the
Yeah, well,
other?
when we can determine it, we'll say correspondent with.
Okay.
Otherwise, if we don't know, we just really say associated.
The
So-
correspondent with actually means they did know each other.
They exchanged letters.
That's the two things you have, or you have
Yeah,
more?
that's the only thing, two things we have. But say, put this into a cooperative and come up with a nice list of possible relations, based on some nice ontology, then it could be differentiated. But there's not enough data available to us to any reliable kind of way to be more refined.
Thanks a lot.